record. And then I say, welcome to you, mill lovers. And thank you for joining this international conference on tidal mills in the USA. My name is Nicole Bakker. I'm doing this short introduction only to welcome you as always and to ask you to mute your microphone if you're not speaking. And then I give the screen to Elisa Crawford, who prepared this conference with her colleagues to introduce us to what we can expect. I think it's up to you, Elisa. So you have to unmute yourself, I think, Elisa. Yeah. Yes, there you are.
Thank you. So as Nicole said, my name is Elisa Crawford. I'm an international miller, being American-born and Dutch certified in wind, water, and grain milling. The picture that you see behind me is of my very first mill, where I began as an apprentice at the age of 17, and where I learned the art of milling and dressing millstones under Charlie Howell.
Sweetheart.
It's called the Atlas Mill, and it's a water-powered mill built in the 1830s, and it's located in the state of Michigan. We're so pleased that each of you could join us today to learn more about water-powered mills of the United States. So on behalf of my mill colleagues, we extend a very warm welcome to you. We will be taking a journey today through the U.S. as we hear from 4 speakers about water-powered mills. So we will begin our journey today through the U.S., and we will begin in Pennsylvania, where we will hear from Tony Shahan, who will provide an overview on U.S. water-powered mills. And then we will head north to the state of Maine, where we will hear from Harry Hopcroft, who will tell us more about tide mills of the U.S. Next, we will head down the East Coast to Virginia to hear from Steve Bashore to learn about George Washington's grist mill. And then we will journey to the West Coast to the state of California to hear from Mario Scalise and learn about the Bale Mill. For those of you who may be new to these conferences, the purpose of this international network is to help preserve the craft of a miller. Therefore, it is not only helpful to learn about different mills, but to consider important aspects to the work of being a miller. I have pondered what elements are essential to helping support and preserve the craft of a miller, and have come up with these 4 points. A miller needs, number 1, a good working mill. Number 2, access to a skilled millwright. Number 3, knowledge for the miller. Number 4, revenue to support the above. I encourage you to listen closely for these 4 points and our last 2 speakers, and then to consider how and if these points are being addressed at the mill that you are associated with. If they are not, perhaps you can take away some ideas for how to do so. With that, I would like to begin our journey through the United States and introduce our first speaker. Tony Shahan is the executive director of the Newlin grist mill in southeastern Pennsylvania and is one of America's oldest continuously operated water mills. He has spent the past 31 years researching and working in all areas of historic mills, from restoration and archaeology to education and collections care. He combines degrees in history and museum studies and has a background in historic trades such as carpentry, timber framing, masonry, and blacksmithing to help keep the stories of milling alive. His latest endeavor is an experimental archaeology project to build a wooden water wheel using early 18th century tools and techniques. His other interests include artillery restoration, historic foodways, and recreating brewing and distilling techniques. So with that, we will hear from Tony.
Good day, everyone. My name is Tony Shahan. I'm the executive director for the Newlin grist mill. I'm also vice president for the Society for Preservation of Old Mills and the Spoom Archive as well. I'm going to speak to you today a little bit about water mills in America, with a little overview, trying to put some context together for the other speakers that are going to be following. The Mabry Mill in Virginia is one of the most photographed mills in North America and is seen by many as a defining image of an American mill. The reality of American water mills is a story with a broader variety of mills that are dependent upon place and time. The history of milling in North America was shaped by a combination of influences: European milling traditions brought by colonists, adaptations to conditions they found once in the New World, and technological changes. These factors culminated in the development of a water-powered mill that supplied products for both the Old World and the New World. American mills were influenced by their European predecessors, but the characteristics brought by Europeans were thrown into the mixing pot of America to be adapted to the conditions of the land, shaped by market demands, and altered by new technologies. The result was an American mill with regional variations that reflected local conditions and local traditions. As witnessed by the writings of Gansel and Wolfe, 200 years after planting the milling traditions, European countries were sending industrial spies to America to learn about those American mills. The history of water milling in North America begins with the arrival of European settlers who came to establish permanent settlements during the 17th century. Early settlers came prepared for the demands of their new home. Some brought mills along with them aboard ship. Those were both animal mills and windmills, and even some prefabricated water mills. A few immediately started building water mills. In Plymouth, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston, the Jenny Mill was the first mill constructed in America in 1636 by immigrants from Holland. This mill operated until the 1840s when it burned. It was later reconstructed in 1970 and is now part of the Plymouth Plantation Museum. The Swedish settlers are known to have built a Norse-style mill on Cobb Creek in Pennsylvania a few years after the Plymouth Mill. The mill was built on stilts over the river, which also made it susceptible to damage from flooding. William Penn purchased this mill shortly after arriving in Philadelphia in 1682 to ensure grain could be ground for his new colony. The mill in this picture was actually brought from Sweden in 1926 to commemorate the original Cobb Creek Mill, but was also swept away by flooding. Many of these early mills did not survive because the traditions brought from Europe were not suited for the larger, faster-flowing waterways found in North America. Other colonists had to operate in areas with too little water. One of the most interesting milling adaptations to the New World can be found in the mill at Mission San Jose, near San Antonio, Texas. In the Southwest, where water was less plentiful, the settlers copied the methods used by indigenous people who had developed clay-lined canals, or acequia, for irrigating their crops. This system was adapted to supplying power to early Spanish mills. As European traditions were adapted to the conditions and specific demands of milling in America, mills started developing patterns of construction with regional variations resulting from local conditions. These mills were all originally constructed between 1680 and 1750, and each reflects their settings. Some have dams that back up water into large ponds. Others have mill races to deliver the water to the mill. They have wooden, stone, and earthen dams, but they are all approximately 2.5 stories and are all similar in size to make it easier to move materials around the mill on an individual's back or by pulley. Other mills had other adaptations. The Stratford Mill follows a similar pattern that we just saw, but it's able to run its mill directly from a small spring-fed lake. This lake has enough volume to keep the mill running year-round. Cave Spring Mill, built in 1814, has risen to 3 stories and has both the grist mill and a sawmill running off of its flume.
Wow.
This is made possible because the flume is fed from an underground river that supplies the mill and other industrial complexes. You look at the basin behind the dam, it actually supplies both what goes to the mill and what's going down the stream, but also runs a concrete production plant as well. At Shepherdstown Mill, originally built in 1738, with an addition in 1835, added a third story. You can see the building on the far right. Took a whole other approach to its water power. They built a freestanding wheel with either a transfer cable or a shaft to the mill on the right. Another West Virginia mill built around the same time actually constructed a wheel in a valley that was freestanding and ran a cable to the top of the mill where the mill was constructed. This was to contend with the deep river valleys that had large flash floods. In the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, several mills that used standpipes to deliver water to their wheels. These pipes went underground to carry water from ponds at a higher elevation. Working like a water level, the water bubbles up into the flume to either power the wheel or be carried away in a spillway. These small log and frame structures were mills with tub wheels in them. They're only usually found in the Great Smoky Mountain area and were ideally suited for the low flow, high velocity mountain streams where there is very little space to build larger mills. Back at the Mabry Mill, if you look at its water system, it sits on the top of a mountain range and there's very little water flowing, but there are several small springs and streams. So what they do is they brought it from several different areas in a series of wooden flumes that are elevated to carry it to the mill. When settlers arrived in America, they found abundant wood, stone, and clay for bricks to build their mills. More importantly, they found vast river systems and a topography well suited to water power. The feature called the fall line is the thin green line on this map that extends from New England into the southern states. It is an ancient line of coastal erosion that separates the coastal plain and the upper Piedmont regions. The fall line provides areas of elevation change averaging around 280 feet. It also represents an important barrier in the river system, since it is usually marked by falls. It often means that it's the highest point ocean-going vessels can go and the lowest point that river-based navigation can descend. Therefore, the fall line offers a significant source of power at the location where trade in raw materials and global export trade routes connect. It's no coincidence that the fall line is host to this series of cities: Boston, Massachusetts, New York, New York, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Wilmington, Delaware, Baltimore, Maryland, Washington, D.C., and Richmond, Virginia. The water system of a mill is one of the primary character-defining features of any water-powered mill site. It is the direct connection to the landscape. Some are short, some long, some sit directly on the water, as we have seen in previous images. The water system at Newlin Grist Mill is approximately a half a mile long. It draws water from two dams on separate creeks and connects them with a diversion channel. A control gate operates and maintains the appropriate volume and speed of the water, and a spillway gate regulates the water height in the mill race. This makes this about a half a mile long working machine built into the landscape. But that also has other features that are quite interesting. The tail race at Newlin Grist Mill is a 210-foot long tunnel made up of stone walls with vaulted ceilings. The tail race was covered over in the 1850s to level the area and allow them to construct an additional mill over the race. The junction of the brick and stone at the top of the tunnel is where the tunnel was originally built under an adjacent building. At the other end of this tunnel is a section that was added in 1857 when the railroad came through. This is actually all dry lane stone arch, which is why we have so many icicles from the water running through the dry lane stone. Newlin Grist Mill's underground system is by far not the biggest raceway tunnel. In Locksport, New York, a mill race was blasted out of the bedrock, and shafts were suspended to the turbines that powered the mills above. It is large enough that today they take boat tours through the race, which now claims to be the largest man-made cave in America. The type of wheel in a mill is dependent upon where the mill is located and the amount of head available, much more than any preference a miller might have. The overshot, undershot, and breast wheels were all used to best take advantage of the available water power at the individual mill site. From examinations of records of historic mills, it appears that the most common wheels were overshot and breast wheels. It is unclear if this is a bias in the records or a bias of survivals, or that is actual preference of the millers themselves. We did have horizontal wheels, and they were used in low head and low demand mills, usually small family or community-based mills. There is a horizontal wheel in the San Jose Mission Mill, and Young's Mill may have also had a horizontal wheel. But once tub wheels became common, they replaced most horizontal wheels. The tub wheel was more efficient by enclosing the wheel and to concentrate the wheel on the paddle, or excuse me, the tub wheel was more efficient by enclosing the wheel to concentrate the water on the paddles. Two examples of tub wheels can be found at the sawmill at Lincoln's New Salem in Illinois and the carding mill at Old Sturbridge Village in Massachusetts. Turbines are much more efficient and the natural evolution of a tub wheel, but they do require a much larger volume of water. Many American millers on small streams found out after converting to turbines that during drier seasons, they had to stop operating or supplement with petroleum-based engines to drive their mills. We also had flutter wheels, which were used in low horsepower situations and required much more water to operate. At the Boone's Homestead sawmill, the wheel is driven by creating a column of water in the tower behind the wheel. You can see by the images how much water is required to operate this wheel. Nearly every country where colonists originated had traditions of tidal mills. Therefore, it should be no surprise that tidal mills and tidal power were used throughout the eastern seaboard, but especially in the north where tides tend to be higher. The exception is the lower right hand, which is Poplar Grove Mill in Virginia. I bring that to your attention because that's also a mill that was once owned by John Lennon. Boats were used in many parts of America, although I have not been able to find an actual image of an American boat mill yet. There are references to their use in the Delaware and Ohio rivers, around Baltimore and in other places. Their mobility seems to have appealed specifically to new settlers moving into an area, for people on military campaigns, and those looking for a way to protect their mills from attack by the indigenous populations. A very important change occurs in America at the beginning of the 18th century with the rise of merchant milling. Initially, mills produced meal mostly for their local community, where it was bolted in a bolting house, bakery, or at home. Most exports of grain products came out of the Hudson Valley in New York and went to other colonies unable to produce enough food to support themselves, like Caribbean islands who focused on producing commodities for the market, Canada with its short growing season, and southern colonies who often focused on tobacco production solely. Between 1690 and 1767 in Pennsylvania, there were 27 separate laws passed, dictating every aspect of the size, construction, and shipment of flour barrels. They also included inspectors and heavy penalties for failing to comply. The goal was to ensure the merchantability of exports of flour. Interestingly, no rules existed for what was being sold domestically. This worked, however, because by 1700, Pennsylvania had come to dominate the export market for flour. By 1772, the Delaware Valley was exporting 250,000 barrels of flour and 38,000 casks of bread each year. So, as one mill historian has said, the Quakers came to do good, and they did very well. Another important influence on American and international mills was the development of Oliver Evans's fully automated mill in 1790. He received the third U.S. patent a year later and changed how milling was organized, the size of mills, and even where the miller spent his time working. The American mill of the 19th century was one of Oliver Evans's impacts on milling. The mills reflected in these images all show how the automatic milling machinery changed both the height of mills and the overall size as they needed more space for grain storage. You also see that they're done regionally in stone, brick, and in frame construction. The evolution of changes in American milling can be seen in Newlin grist mill's architecture. If you look at the right-hand side of this building, the stone section is the original 1704 section of the mill. It once had a stone gable end that was taken down during later alterations. The left-hand side of the building was constructed in 1739 to double the capacity of the mill and to accommodate export demand. The third story was added in the 19th century with the introduction of automatic milling equipment. The cupola added later when equipment like routing heads were needed for just an additional little bit of height. The Brandywine Valley mills were known for the quality of their flour even before Evans, but the introduction of the automatic equipment made them more famous. The lower Delaware River Valley was the center of milling in America until the American Revolution. Then it shifted slightly to Baltimore because more grain was coming down the Susquehanna River. It continued to shift to Western New York and beyond as the population moved west, built suitable transportation in canals and railroads, and the production of grain moved to the Great Plains. Evans also changed milling by creating new opportunities. First, the flour mills had been successful, allowing the accumulation of wealth. This equipment increased the profitability of mills. He also reduced the number of people required to operate a grist mill from 10 to approximately 2. In Newcastle County, Delaware in 1800, there was a survey with 99 water-powered grist mills in operation. So assuming that Oliver Evans' equipment was placed into most of those mills, he freed up approximately 800 skilled mechanics with water-powered experience. While today this might seem a negative, in 1800, the Industrial Revolution was underway in America, and Evans not only helped to create the capital to support building additional mills and manufacturers, he helped provide the skilled labor to support America's expansion. Grist mills continued to grow in size, and in the 19th century, they began adding animal feed to their products. This is one of the late 19th, early 20th century mills here in Pennsylvania called the Milburn Mills. And then here's some examples of the feed and flour operations from the late 19th and early 20th century. All of this together created a massive amount of mills. The map you're looking at now shows the mills that are open to the public for visiting, according to the Society for Preservation of Old Mills mill list. According to the industrial census from 1840, there were over 14,000 water-powered mills operating in the United States. Spoon maintains a list organized by state in the US and province for Canada of all mill sites, whether they're open or not. The US list contains information on 16,774 mill sites, 4,692 of which are still standing. The Canadian list has 867 mills listed, 469 of which are still standing. Spoon's mill list includes 37 tidal mills, but a quick review of the Tide Mill Institute's database revealed 214 mills in the US and 5 in Canada. The majority of these, 176, are in Maine and Massachusetts alone, and their database does not include anything south of New York. I know of a handful in Delaware and Virginia, so there's obviously a lot more work to be done in tidal mill documentation. In the Spoon archives, which is housed here at Newlin Grist Mill, we are working on organizing the archive contents to connect them with this mill list. We will be focusing on the organization of the Pennsylvania mill information for the next couple of years, thanks to a recent grant we received. When I was asked to do this talk, I was also asked to look at some of the types of mills that you could find in America. And they were all over the place. If you had a mill, you probably found an example of it, and I was able to document many of these. Iron furnaces, the first one starts in the late 17th century at the Saugus Iron Works in Massachusetts. But there were foundries, bloomeries, fineries, slitting mills, and rolling mills running throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries in several areas of the United States. We also had a plethora of sawmills, both historic and current. Textile mills. The mill in the upper left-hand corner is the Greenbank Mill. The stone section of that was one of the first 3 woolen mills built in Delaware. It's called the Madison Factory, built in 1810. However, 30 years later, in the lower right-hand corner, this is what the textile industry had become in the Boot Mill in Lowell, Massachusetts. Both of these mills represent textile mills that were converted into flour mills. Paper milling was particularly big in the area where we're at, and the Wilcox family, which the original one, the top mill, was about a mile downstream from where we are. But in the 18th century, they actually made paper for Benjamin Franklin to print the first U.S. currency. A later mill built and operating into the 20th century that you see in the lower image was making U.S. currency paper, including some of the early counterfeit measures that was included in that. We had powder mills for making gunpowder. We had cider mills. We had flint mills. This is one that was locally, and I find this one fascinating because you can see where it was built so the wagons could be actually run through and the materials dumped into the wagons from the floor above. We also had bone mills where they were crushing up and breaking up bone for use in fertilizer and actually as supplements for other things as well. Thank you for your time. I want to end with talking about 2 of these wonderful little types of mills that we have dotted all over the Mid-Atlantic region. They're pump mills and they're little hydro mills, usually for individual estates. As you can see, we have a plethora of mill types, and we have a strong tradition of water-powered milling in America. Hope you enjoy the rest of this presentation.
Thank you, Tony. That was a wonderful and fascinating overview of U.S. water-powered mills. I know it may have stimulated quite a few questions from the audience. So just a reminder that we will take questions at the end of this conference after the speakers have all finished. So please save your questions, don't forget them, and we'll be delighted to ask the speakers at that point. So next, I would like to go on to our second speaker, and introduce Harry Hopcroft. So he has a fascinating background. He's been working with microcomputers and small networks since 1981. He retired in 2014, and he's been very busy since then in a variety of fields of interest, including Midcoast Senior College, where he was recruited to the leadership board of the Tide Mill Institute. So he's been studying the tide mills of Georgetown, Maine for the past 2 years. And he's currently curating a small exhibit on the tide mills at the Georgetown Historical Society. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce Harry, and we'd love to hear from Harry about tide mills.
Hello, Millers. Harry Hopcroft here, and I'm representing this morning the Tide Mill Institute, and I'm pleased and honored to be able to join you today for a short discussion of tide mills on this side of the Atlantic and how we mean to proceed with our studies at the Tide Mill Institute. Now, from what I can see, it didn't take people very long after deciding grain should be ground up to also decide it was a lot like work to do it. Animals of various sorts helped for a while, but you then had to house, feed, and care for them when they were not actually at work. Wind and water were the obvious next choice. The insides of a specific type of mill don't change much once the driving wheel is turning. It mostly just depends on the job we need done inside. Whether the driving wheel is turned by humans, animals, wind, or water doesn't really matter. Really, tide mill technology is not new, nor was it in any way invented here in North America. I have seen hints of tide mills being built as early as 60 to 100 AD in London's River Fleet, and a tide mill built in Brittany, France, about 580 AD that has been well documented. There was also a tide mill at Nendrum Monastery in Strongerloch, Northern Ireland, which I hope I've pronounced correctly, which dates from about 619 AD, and which is the oldest I've found that has been both excavated and documented. We got started in the USA a bit later than 619 AD, of course, but by the mid-1700s, there were as many as 500 or so tide mills along the eastern seaboard. The earliest of which I'm aware here in Maine, having been built at York in 1634. Early settlers in what is now the US were of necessity coastal dwellers who were entirely beholden to rivers and oceans for transportation and commerce. They quickly adapted their familiarity with European milling to the new environment of river flow and tidal power. They also had a lot of forests and a big need to build boats and housing. That meant that while we certainly had our share of water and tide-powered grist mills, fulling mills, and carding mills, many of the tide mills here were made for cutting wood. This site in Georgetown, Maine, had a double sawmill on the right and a grist and shingle mill on the left. Those early mills used the mechanically much simpler up and down saw technology until about 1830, when the circular saw was introduced and made the process much more efficient. After talking with Lissa, I've agreed to a short detour here to discuss a topic of personal interest, which is the question of tide mills versus tidal mills. Most people, even those at the Tide Mill Institute, you tend to use the terms interchangeably. The difference was nicely described by a 20th century geographical historian named Peveril Meigs. And I like to keep the distinction. The Meigs definition is that a tidal mill is one built on a tidal flat to facilitate the loading and unloading of small ships. It would generally be water powered, but might get that power from a stream or a pond. A true tide mill is powered directly by the action of the tides. A tide mill then is necessarily also a tidal mill, because it's on the tidal flats, but a tidal mill is not always a tide mill by that definition. This mill, for instance, is one that once stood where there is now a library in Somersville, Mount Desert Island here in eastern Maine. This side of it is clearly tidal, but its power came from the other side, where there is a small stream-fed pond, and I would call this mill tidal. Tide mills and tidal mills were equally vital to the New World economy in their day. But in this country, as here at this site on the mill in East Branch of Robin Hood Cove in Georgetown, Maine, there's often very little left of them anymore. And there's a danger, a real danger, of their becoming a lost part of our history. Their loss was due, of course, to a combination of technological and economic factors. First, they were obviously restricted in where we could put them. They need wide tidal flats with large tides where the dams can be built without interfering with other economic activities. Large logs then needed to be able to be floated down to the mills, either by a river on the mouth of which the mill was often constructed, or around via an ocean passage of the rafts of logs. They then needed to be where small ships could be loaded in order for commercial operations to be financially successful. In fact, they were often co-located with shipbuilding facilities made or owned by the same people. Secondly, tide mills could generally not be run full-time. The power for a tide mill is a function of the difference in the height of the water at high tide and low tide. When the tide is in flood, the gates float open, and the impoundment area, or holding pond, fills to the same level as the tide itself. The gates then float closed on the ebb and trap the water in the pond. In general, it requires a tide height of at least 4 to 5 feet in order to get enough power to run a mill. Here in Maine, we average around 9 to 11 feet of tidal range, in some spots as high as 38 to 60 feet. The mill, however, clearly cannot run while the water level inside and outside the dam is the same. The water level outside needs to be below the level of the water wheel in order to extract the power from the flow. That means the mill sits idle until the tide has fallen. Then the sluice gate can be opened and the now powerful water flow directed to the wheel. That makes for some very strange working hours, since the tides occur about 50 minutes later each day, and you worked when the tide let you work. Better way was needed. And the final death blow to tide mills came with the introduction of steam power. Steam meant the mill could be run on a regular schedule, or even full time. Since the mill doesn't make any money unless it's running, and unless the operators are awake and alert, millers quickly caught on to the benefits of steam. We'll hear shortly about a couple of sites at which some excellent restorative work has been done, but there are only a handful of those sites, and none that have been milling commercially since about 1930. Tide Mill Institute, where I serve on the leadership board, is one of a very small number of organizations now seriously studying tide mills and their history. The Tide Mill Institute was founded in 2005 at the Dorchester Historical Society in Boston, Mass, by 3 researchers who remain active with the organization. Begun under the sponsorship of the Dorchester Historical Society, the Tide Mill Institute is now operated as a separate, nonprofit, tax-exempt corporation registered in the state of Maine, USA. Tide Mill Institute has developed a multifaceted mission, which we generally group into 4 areas, and we'll look briefly at each of them. The first of those missions is to advance an appreciation of American and international heritage of tide mill technology. We do that in several ways. One is to offer tide mill talks to historical societies and other interested organizations. These can be in person, virtual, or hybrid, and typically feature an overview of historical tide mills, then a focus on local tide mills of special interest to the audience, and often ending with an update on the latest news on tidal power generation. More than 600 attendees have enjoyed these talks to date. We next produce and screen videos about historic tide mill sites, including flyovers using cameras mounted on small drones, showing visible remains. We also make videos of our own annual conferences, the next of which is coming up at 8:30 a.m. at the University of Southern Maine in Portland, Maine, on October 28th, just 4 days from now. We'll gather then, both in person and virtually, to share information in much the way we're doing it today. Our schedule this year includes a discussion by Mark Borton of his new book on Passamaquoddy Bay Project, discussion by Jesse Kofelis, an archaeologist on the Bell's Mill site excavation in Edmonds Township, Maine, this past summer. Presentation on the future of tidal powered electricity generation in Maine by Kerry Grantham on the U.S. Department of Energy, and a talk by Ronald Rudin discussing Acadian dikes. Registration for the conference is available at the TMI website, which is www.tidemillinstitute.org. Tide Mill Institute then encourages and supports research into the location and history of tide mill sites. Those efforts even include sponsoring archaeological investigations of selected sites. Most recently of the Bell's Mill site in Edmonds Township, Maine, on which we'll have a discussion at our conference this weekend. The full report on the dig will be made available to Tide Mill Institute's members and subscribers very soon. Tide Mill Institute's leadership team boasts several distinguished authors who write about the history of tidal power. Robert Gordon and Patrick Malone, emeritus professors at Yale and Brown Universities, respectively, published recently an article in 2019 called Water History. It's about Boston's 1813 perpetual power system, the continuous tidal power that was provided by this innovative two-basin system enabled development of a complex industrial innovation hub, including a grist mill, ironworks, foundry and machine shop, a hemp mill, and a veneer sewing factory. Mark C. Borton's thoroughly researched book, Moondoggle, published this year by Downey's Books, documents the ultimately frustrating saga of the never-built Passamaquoddy tidal power plant in a highly readable fashion. Had it been implemented, the Quoddy system would have produced a whopping 3 billion kilowatt hours per year on the extraordinarily high tides of Passamaquoddy Bay. Tide Mill Institute then serves as a repository of tide mill data for students, scholars, engineers, and the general public, and to support and expand the community of these tide mill stakeholders. That primarily involves the International Tide Mill Database, conceived and constructed by TMI's Bob Gray and available on the TMI website. The database now contains at least 650 entries. It keeps growing, of course, of which more than 430 are visible on Google Maps. Local seventh generation sawyer John Morse is working now on permission to exhibit some of the artifacts from his family's long milling history at the Maine Maritime Museum, and we have had a small exhibit on display of local milling relics, tools, and educational pieces at the Georgetown Historical Society in Georgetown, Maine, all summer. Our fourth mission is to promote appropriate reuses of old tide mill sites and the development of the use of tide as an energy source. In 2023, TMI joined National Hydropower Association and participates in their marine energy and small hydro councils. That exposes our leadership to the latest cutting-edge information in marine energy, and which we can then pass on to our members. For the future, we're seeking grants to fund the development of a tidal hydropower demonstrator in Maine to educate the public about tidal power's potential. We envision a small barge that could be secured in a fast tidal current connected to a small turbine and generator. We could then move that to various high visibility locations. This photo is a model built several years ago by a gentleman in Georgetown, Maine named Will Anza, and some local school children. It worked, but it was very bulky and has since been lost. We, of course, welcome additional industry and/or academic partnerships for any of these projects. And here again is my own contact information for anyone who would like more specifics on what we've been discussing. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Harry. That was a remarkable and fascinating overview of tide mills in the U.S. And I find it absolutely fascinating that there were so many tide mills in the U.S. at one time. As Tony mentioned, additional work is going to be done to be able to research some of the southern tide mills, I believe. And just a note, Harry mentioned that there's the Tide Mill Institute conference coming up on October 28th. So that's coming up shortly, if you'd like to learn more. And then Tony also mentioned SPOOM, and I would just like to restate what that organization is for all of you. That's the Society for the Preservation of Old Mills. That's the American Mill Society. And Tony serves as archivist. So that may help understand a little bit more about the milling world in the US. At this point, we would like to invite all of you to take a short 5-minute break. When we return from our break, we're going to be hearing from Steve Bashore about the George Washington's grist mill, which will be fascinating. So if you would like to pause and get a cup of tea or coffee, is that all right, Nicole, if we do that? Okay, very good. So please return to us on screen in 5 minutes, but feel free to turn your camera off or go whatever, take a little short break, and we'll see you soon. Thank you. Okay, we invite you to rejoin. Bring your coffee, your tea, your mug, whatever you need to bring, or chocolate. Hopefully we're getting everyone back because we've got some exciting speakers coming up next. All right, I think everyone has rejoined. Great. I would like to introduce our next speaker for the group. His name is Steve Bashore. He is the Director of Historic Trades and Head Distiller at George Washington's Mount Vernon. In this position, he oversees the interpretation, operations, and maintenance of Washington's distillery and grist mill, as well as the farm and blacksmith shop. Steve is a traditional miller and distiller by trade and has been operating, interpreting, and repairing historic water mills for 29 years. Since 2007, he has been running George Washington's distillery, producing rye whiskey, bourbon, single malt whiskey, rum, as well as peach and apple brandy. That's quite a few drinks. So with that, I would like to introduce my friend Steve Bashore as the next speaker.
Well, it's wonderful to be with everyone today. I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Steve Bashore. I'm the Director of Historic Trades and Head Distiller at George Washington's Mount Vernon. And at Mount Vernon, we do have a reconstruction of George Washington's mill and whiskey distillery. And the story at Mount Vernon for milling really goes back to 1770 when George Washington builds a large merchant mill on one of his outlying farms. The reason he did this was he was abandoning tobacco as the cash crop at Mount Vernon. The land was very exhausted from growing tobacco. It's very hard on the soil. It takes a lot of nitrogen out of the soil. So he was concerned about falling into debt being a tobacco planter. So he built a large merchant mill, and that mill's purpose was to export flour. The mill also ground for everyone that lived and worked at Mount Vernon. That included enslaved people, indentured servants, and the Washington family and hired staff. So the mill was both internal and external for him. It made money, but it also fed the estate. So the first video we want to show you is an introduction to the mill and what we have here today. It is a reconstruction. It was done in 1932 by the state of Virginia. And then in the 1990s, Mount Vernon took it over, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, which owns and operates Mount Vernon, and did a major restoration to make the mill function again. Millwright Derek Ogden was the consulting millwright on this project. So, of course, Derek, as many of you know, passed away in February at 93 years of age, and he was a talented man, quite a character, but he influenced a lot of us over the years. So his work is all over the mill. And also our millwright, Gus Kiorpis, who I might talk about later. Gus is the man that built most of the gears and under Derek's direction, and Gus still maintains the mill today. So let's go ahead and take a look at this first video. It'll kind of introduce you to the site and what goes on there, and then we will rejoin and talk a little more. So as we saw in that initial video, it kind of gives you a good overview of the site. We do a lot of tours, a lot of educational programs, evening programs as well. So our job there is to really engage the public. But it is a working mill, so we do grind grain 10 months a year, and we run a lot more than a lot of historic mills do. And we do food product for our retail shops, food product for our restaurant. We supply a couple other small restaurants in the area. And of course, we grind about 20,000 pounds of grain a year just for whiskey production. So those who come to the site in season get the full experience of both buildings and understand more about milling in the 18th century and also grain markets, things that went on during that time period. Now, the mill changed over time, and in late 1780s, Washington's president, of course, and he learns of a new patented system that had been developed by Oliver Evans. And the way that takes place is that Evans applies for a federal patent. The U.S. Patent Office was formed in 1790. So believe it or not, Washington had to put his signature on approved patents. And he also sent it down the road to have Jefferson sign it. And that we didn't have a big bureaucracy back then like we do in Washington today. So much smaller government, but everybody had to be involved in approving patents. And one might say that that was insider trading, that Washington reads this document and realizes he needs it in his mill. But there's another part of the story, which is George Washington took a trip to the northern states during his first term and to the southern states. And this was part of his effort to unify the country. You know, those colonies were very different attitudes, very different ancestry, very different peoples. And so part that he felt to unify the young nation was he took a journey north and then south. And when he was going north, he stopped in the Brandywine Valley area, Wilmington area, Delaware. And of course, this is close to Oliver Evans's home stomping grounds. And one of those millers who was a Quaker had recently installed the Oliver Evans system in one of his mills. So we believe Washington saw it running as well as seeing the paperwork of the Evans patent. So when Mount Vernon restored or reconstructed the guts of the mill, the works of the mill, the decision was made that we should also restore the whole Evans system. So we're one of only 2 mills in the United States that has a fully functioning Evans system. And we do run it with grain through the whole system. The other mill is a great mill, but they run it dry usually just to demonstrate. So this video we're going to show you is the Oliver Evans system in full working, with the grain elevators working, the hopper boy that many of you may have heard of. And we're the only mill in America I know that runs its wheat flour through the hopper boy. So we'll go ahead and watch this video and talk a little more afterwards.
I'm Steve Bashore, Director of Historic Trades here at Mount Vernon, and I'm standing inside George Washington's reconstructed grist mill. Right here we have a set of millstones which grind corn, but for Washington the key product was wheat and wheat flour. In 1770-71 he built this mill with the eye toward exporting superfine white flour, and it did so for many, many years. However, in 1791, when George Washington's president, he learns of a new patented system designed by a gentleman named Oliver Evans, which greatly improved his grist mill. And we're going to take you through the mill today and learn about this system. Our mill is quite unique in the United States today, as that we have the only fully functioning Oliver Evans system that is run regularly with flour and grain passing through the system. It made Washington's mill much more productive and efficient, and Oliver Evans himself ends up receiving the 3rd U.S. patent ever given for this unique invention.
The way patents worked in the 18th century was quite interesting in that there was no official bureaucracy to approve patents. So part of George Washington's job as president was to sign approved patents. And one day an interesting document crossed his desk, which was the document by Oliver Evans for the automated flour milling system. Washington read it over and realized how ingenious this was and that he needed it at Mount Vernon. And after signing it and passing it on to Thomas Jefferson for his signature, Washington had Tobias Lear, his private secretary, write to Oliver Evans in Philadelphia requesting that Evans come to Mount Vernon to install the system in his mill. As it happens, Oliver Evans could not get free of business to make the journey south, so he sent his 2 brothers to Mount Vernon, who were millwrights, to help retrofit George Washington's mill with the new automated flour milling system. Oliver Evans received his patent. It actually is U.S. patent number 3 in the line of patents in the early part of our history. And George Washington becomes one of the first men in the early United States to have the newest and finest grist mill innovation. As you enter the mill, you'll see this hole in the floor. It's actually a wheat sink. This is where the grain would enter the mill and enter the new system. It drops down into a large grain bin below called the garner. And that is fed by a chute, which is a gravity chute that feeds right down into bucket elevator number 1. Oliver Evans is the inventor of the bucket elevator. This is a continuous belt with little cups on it to transport grain vertically in the mill. This is a labor-saving device, and no longer would grain have to be hoisted or carried upstairs to the next level of the process. So the grain would enter the mill, journey up the water-powered elevator, and be dumped into bins on the 4th floor. After receiving it in the bins, the grain would then feed down another sink, which enters a device to clean the grain. This is called the rolling screen. It's basically a way to separate chaff and other debris from your wheat seed. Rolling screens existed long before Oliver Evans, and Washington undoubtedly would have had a rolling screen in his mill when it was first constructed in 1770. But now this machine is fed automatically by an elevator instead of human hands. The rolling screen separates out those debris and sends the grain down another long chute directly to the hopper over the millstones. To make export flour, Washington knew he needed the highest quality millstones for this purpose, and he installed in the early period a set of French burr stones. These are freshwater quartz stones quarried along the Marne River outside Paris, and they were used in Europe as early as the 1300s. By the time Virginia is settled, thousands of these millstones are brought into the colonies for making the very best flour, and George Washington knew he needed a set of these to accomplish his goal of export flour. The French stones are able to grind this flour into very fine particles to create white flour. The top stone that's inside this casing rotates, powered by the gearing and the water wheel below. Beneath the upper stone is a stone called the bedstone, which mounts to the floor. It's stationary. It never turns. The grain starts in the hopper and feeds down through the hole in the center stone to be ground into flour. And once again, it goes down a chute by gravity, and it's going to enter elevator number 2. Elevator number 2 then transports this grain back up to the 4th floor, where it's dumped out on a large rake or flour cooler known as the hopper boy. This is another part of the Oliver Evans invention. Flour had to be cooled in order to prepare it for sifting. During grinding, the meal can get quite warm. If not properly cooled prior to sifting, this flour will have a difficult time making it all the way to market without spoilage. Oliver Evans realized the need for cooling of flour, and so he invented an automatic rake, and he named it the Hopper Boy, named for the young men who used to do this work by hand. The Hopper Boy will rotate, powered by the water wheel, and it'll spread and cool the flour gradually, moving it from the outer portion of the circle all the way to the center, where it drops down another gravity chute to feed the large sifter known as the bolting chest. Washington's mill would have had a bolting chest in its early period. Bolters were in existence since the 1500s, and George Washington, from the early time, knew he wanted to make export flour, so the bolter was a critical piece of machinery. The bolter is a large reel inside a wooden case that rotates by water power, allowing the flour to sift through silk, known as bolting cloth or silk. This grades the flour into superfine white flour, which was the highest commodity, brought the most value and price. It also makes a fine flour, which we would know today as whole wheat, and it also separates the bran. The bran was not thrown out. It was used to make hardtack biscuit and was sold locally in Alexandria. Right along the river, all the sea captains would purchase this product and make the hardtack biscuit. So for Washington, the mill produces 3 products, 2 overseas and 1 domestically. The bolting chest is a key piece of equipment. With the Oliver Evans system, it is now fed by very cool flour from the Hopper Boy, and at the bottom of this machine, the flour then drops down to the appropriate barrel, all ready for packaging and shipping. Again, human hands are not needed to accomplish all this work. So for Oliver Evans, from the beginning of the entrance of the wheat into the mill, transported through the cleaning process, through the millstones, up to be cooled, down through the sifter, and finally into a barrel, it completes the process without the human hands touching the grain. A great innovation and worthy of patent number 3. Washington would have had to pay $50 as a licensing fee per pair of stones to run the Evans system, and we know from our records that he selected 1 set of stones in the mill to be on the Evans system. The other set of stones were in domestic use for his own needs, grinding corn to feed the plantation, grinding oats for livestock feed, grinding rye and barley, and particularly in the later years as he builds his whiskey distillery, the mill is critical to that process as well.
I hope everyone enjoyed seeing that Evans system in operation. It is unique to see one working. We've all read about it, or most of us have glanced at Oliver Evans' text from 1795, and In that video, you'll also see another gentleman. That's Peter Curtis, who worked with us for many years. Pete now works and gives tours at the mansion at Mount Vernon. Guy's always in great shape. He's 75 and does not look it. But Pete worked at Phillipsburg Manor Mill up in New York and worked under and studied under Charlie Howe, the English miller. So Charlie came to America many years ago, was a colleague of Derek Ogden's, and so Pete learned under him. And I think the milling world in America owes a debt both to Derek and to Charlie. The next video we're going to show also has a Charlie Howe connections, and this is a stone dressing video we did some years ago with Robert Grossi. Rob Grossi is worked on the East Coast at Hagley Mills, I believe. Not Hagley, what's the one in New England? Anyway, he worked in New England. He's from New York. He's a millwright. He's a carpenter. He's also a millstone dresser, and he learned from Charlie Howe. And as we all know, if you don't take care of your machinery or your stones, you're not going to have a good outcome with your product. So Rob comes out to the East Coast because he currently lives in California, in Sonoma area, and he helps run Bale Grist Mill, or he's been involved in Bale for a number of years with others. So this video kind of goes into great detail about the art of stone dressing, what you're trying to achieve. And I think this one really explains it really well. So let's go ahead and take a little bit of a look at this video about the millstone dressing.
Well, it's wintertime at Mount Vernon, and people often ask what we do at the mill and distillery in the wintertime. Well, obviously we're not running. It's so cold in here. But what we do accomplish is a lot of maintenance work to keep this machinery going. And one of the key things we do here with the millstones is sharpen them, which the term they use for that is dressing the stones. And we have a gentleman here who's an expert millstone dresser who's been doing it about 30 years. He's also a miller, and his name is Rob Grossi. And so Rob's going to talk to you all about why this is so important and how the trade is done. Well, Rob, it's real good to have you in the mill doing this work for us, because without you sharpening these stones regularly, we just could not grind the grain properly. And for visitors who've been to Mount Vernon or seen our things that we posted online, the stones are usually covered by wooden apparatus. Right, we call mill furniture, and it simply has a hopper and a casing, and that delivers the grain in between these two stones. The bottom stone we're looking at, that's the one that never turns, right?
Stationary, yeah, called the bedstone.
And then up here we have the runner stone, which is now up on the crane, but normally this is made to fit right down on that spindle, and the power of the water wheel and the gears rotates that stone, and that's how we accomplish the grinding.
Right.
But obviously now you've got your stone up here, so could you talk a little bit about what you've done here and what you're working on?
Sure. Well, when I first got here, we lifted the runner stone off, turned it upside down, exposing the grinding face. And you can see I recut the pattern back in the stones. And that's critical. That pattern is called the millstone dress pattern. And it's been around actually for thousands of years. The Greeks and the Romans used it. And it's really imperative to have a millstone dress pattern, because it really grinds and shears that grain and moves it out when it's working. And I'm not sure if people know how millstones work, but the grain flows in through the top stone, gets caught between the top and bottom millstone, drawn in by these grooves we call furrows, and it works its way around, gradually getting finer and finer until it exits the stones as finished flour.
And then of course you can see the hole over there in the floor where everything goes down to be sifted. So over time, if you're running a lot of grain through a stone, as Washington's mill did, it's going to wear down these grooves, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, these millstones don't touch each other. That's very, very critical, as you know, as a miller. But they do wear down from the friction of the grinding process. And we have to renew and resharpen the stones in a mill that was working like George Washington's mill maybe once a month.
That often, huh?
Yeah, that often.
Yeah.
So here I am down on the millstones, and I was just working on a section of them, recutting the pattern. We talked about the millstone dress pattern. And I'm using some tools that haven't changed for centuries, really. The only thing that has changed is I cheat a little bit, and I have carbide tool steel tips that are put in place of just high carbon tool steel. And basically, this is a thrift. It's a wooden handle, and it holds the metal pick or bill. I've got several of them here. And it's basically just a stone cutting chisel. but it's really highly refined. And I'm going to show you just quickly here. And I just lift and drop the tool and cut the pattern back in the stones. And we talked about millstone dress and how critical it is. It's divided really into two portions. We have the deeper grooves that are called furrows. And between the furrows are these flat surfaces we call lands. Just like in a farm field, you have furrows and lands, plowed field. It's agriculture, it's been called that for centuries. And the furrows have a deeper section. They taper up fine right to the lands, called a feather edge. And the lands themselves, they have cracking lines or stitching, we call it. We have to cut that back in occasionally because they do wear. And that's where all the flowering, the fine flowering happens right up on these lands. Grain flows in, the center starts to move its way out and gets abraded by this. Very critical.
So I hope you enjoyed learning about the art of millstone dressing from Robert Grassi, and appreciate his skill today and knowledge. And please come back to Mount Vernon this spring. The mill opens April 1st, and those stones will be grinding grain once again.
Well, I hope everyone enjoyed hearing from Rob Grassi. And again, I now remember the mill, which I'm sorry I couldn't earlier, is the Hanford Mills that Rob worked at, which was interesting because it also later added steam power to help run that mill. And we know that things carry on from the early periods into more modern power for mills. So I think that Rob's a gem. You know, Rob has so much knowledge, and that's part of what we all need to do is preserve this knowledge, both maintaining the mills, dressing the stones, running the mills. So the question becomes, how do we do all of that? So, you know, one thing is you have to have a good mill that's in decent working order for anybody to learn. And I've been fortunate over the years to work at 3 different mills, and they were all fairly well maintained. That's not the case for everyone, but caring for the machinery is really twofold. One is to, you know, mills rust if they rest, they need to run. And secondly, you have to have the ability to train someone on a good working mill and have it be prepared properly. So for me, I learned from other people. You know, that often is how it happens in the United States, in that we don't have a formalized training program per se, not of the caliber of the Netherlands or other parts of Europe that do the training. But I know that the Netherlands is like the gold standard of miller training in many, many ways. So over here in this country, you have to, you know, get lucky in that I worked at a mill, and the man that ran the mill liked me, and he asked me if I wanted to learn how to run it because he saw I had interest in it. So that's what I've looked for over the years, is to looking for that next person that has real interest in it. Because if you don't have desire or passion, or you're not willing to get dirty and work hard, they're not the right person for the mill, as we all know, because you find out pretty quickly who's serious about it after you have a real hard day at the mill. Some people fade away. So I learned from a gentleman at another mill named Mike Henry, who was, we didn't run that mill often, but I learned a lot from Mike. And then I went to Stratford Mill, worked with another gentleman there who was the farm manager, who taught me quite a bit. And along the way was learning from Derek Ogden as well, the millwright. For me, over the years, I've searched for a good apprentice miller, and thankfully 10 years ago found Corey Welshans, who's my head miller now. And Corey was a mechanic for years in the auto industry, so he's very skilled with his hands. And I think that's what you need to look for, somebody with passion and desire, and that you think you can pass this on. Because if we don't pass it on, you know, things are going to fade away. So the next thing you really need is access to a proper millwright, because we've all seen bad repairs of mills and things that happen that are inappropriate for the time period of the mill or the materials used in restoring the mill. I mean, sometimes you have to upgrade things. We all know about that. Bearings, you know, sail stocks, things like that do get upgraded to a new material just for the longevity of the mill. But we want to try to preserve these machines as much as possible in the manner in which they were cared for in the times they were built and run. So Derek was the first millwright I ever met, and learned a lot from him. And then I've also worked with Ben Hassett, who was Derek's apprentice. Ben's in Louisville, Kentucky now. And Ben has worked on many mills across the United States and in the Caribbean as well. Ben does windmills and water mills, just as Derek did. And at Mount Vernon now, we're lucky to have Gus Kiorpis. And Gus worked with Derek on the restoration, and so he still maintains our mill. So every winter we get about 10 weeks of work on our mill, which is excellent for the machinery and excellent to keep it running during the season. So I think it's critical wherever you are to take care of those millwrights and work with millwrights to make sure the machines are properly cared for. And of course, I think the last thing we all face is how do you fund these things? You know, these are expensive projects. These are expensive machines. And I run into people sometimes that say, we bought this old mill and we want to restore it. And then you tell them what it might cost and they're flabbergasted, because it's like buying a house with machinery in it. As we all know, you're buying two things that need help: the structure, the roof, but all the machinery. So there's a lot of good institutions in Europe and in the United States that do fund preservation. So we work with a lot of those throughout the country to try to find the funds and the donors, and sometimes it's private donors that help raise the money to do something. Like Pierce Mill in Rock Creek Park had a Friends of group that raised over $2 million for that mill at one time. At Mount Vernon, we're distinctive in that we don't take any state or federal money. We never have since the 19th century, so it's all private funds. And we have a few donors that like the mill that help us out from time to time. But one of the things I'm fortunate to do is to make George Washington's whiskey. And that was a big revenue stream for George Washington in the 1790s, and it's a pretty big revenue stream for us at Mount Vernon today. So some of that funding for our site comes right out of the whiskey that's made on site. So not everybody has that option, but I think that working with donors and philanthropists and people that care about these machines, you always have to be looking for them. There are people out there that just don't know about the need. But I think working in your communities and within your countries to do so, there are dollars there to preserve these machines, and that's part of our jobs too, as stewards of them. So again, I've been honored to be with you all, and I look forward to the rest of the program and hearing from others. And I hope if you make it to the States, you can come visit Mount Vernon if you have the time. So thank you again.
Great. Thank you, Steve. I know everyone enjoyed your presentation along with the wonderful videos highlighting Mount Vernon and George Washington's grist mill. So I hope all of you were able to listen and hear those 4 points that we mentioned earlier that are essential for helping preserve and support the craft of a miller. I know I heard them in Steve's presentation, and hopefully we can hear them. I'm sure we can in the next one, which will be Mario Scalise. So he is the miller at Bale Grist Mill, State Historic Park near St. Helena in California. He's been with Bale Mill for 10 years, and he's the 4th generation from a milling and millwright family from Italy. So Bale Mill has an incredible 36-foot overshot water wheel, which is one of the largest in the country. Mario remembers first going to the Bale Mill in 1963 when he was just a little boy, and that his family had a vineyard in the Napa Valley at that time. So next, we would love to hear from Mario.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Mario Scalise, and I'm a grist miller at the Bale Grist Mill State Historic Park in Northern California. I've been working there about 10 years. Just a little personal introduction. My great-grandfather was a millwright in Calabria, Italy, and that's in southern Italy. He built 6 grist mills in his life, and my grandfather ran one until probably about 1920 to 25. And these are a kind of a classic mill that you would see throughout the Mediterranean, southern Mediterranean for a grist mill. It's with a water tower and a Norse wheel, and no specific cleaning equipment or anything like that, no fancy equipment, but long abandoned. But that's not the topic today. The topic today is the Bale Grist Mill history, and we'll start with that. So this part of California was inhabited by an indigenous peoples for about 12,000 years who lived in harmony and got along well with the environment. And it became part of the Spanish Empire about 350 years ago, something like this. And Spain was really good at finding gold. You know, the Aztecs and in Chile and in Peru, and they didn't find any gold in California, unfortunately for them, but there was a lot of gold here too. That was discovered during the American period in the 1840s. So they didn't really take much interest in this area, this territory. People living in Mexico got sick and tired of their king. Carlos VII was the last one. They kicked him out, had a revolution, and in 1823, they established a fledgling democratic society with a constitutional government. Well, they woke up the next morning and realized they didn't have a lot of money and they didn't have a lot of people. This part of California, as we call it, was called at the time Alta California, High California, as opposed to Baja California. And it started in San Diego and went to Oregon. And it had a population of maybe 100,000, including all the native peoples. There weren't a lot of people living here. The capital of it was Monterey, about 100 miles south of San Francisco, and it was a big cosmopolitan area, whopping population of maybe 1,000, about maybe 80 foreigners living there. Dr. Bale was born and raised in London, went to 6 medical schools, ran up a ton of debt, and he was going to be thrown in debtor's prison. So he abandoned his wife, jumped on a plane. I'm sorry, not a plane. He jumped on a ship and sailed away as a surgeon on board, landed in Monterey and lived there for a year. The government said, if you live here for a year, you can become a Mexican. And then if you marry a Mexican woman legally, you can become a Mexican inhabitant who can own land. And this idea was that they were going to give land away for free. People were going to grow things that would be prosperous. They'd grow a society, have lots of children, and pay their taxes. And that's what the idea was. Bale married a young woman by the name of Maria Ignacia Seberanis, and he got a land grant of approximately 20,000 acres, 70 million square meters of land, and absolutely hated it. It was in the middle of nowhere, nothing here but grizzly bears and cougars. And he made the best of it, built a large style adobe, lived a classic Spaniard lifestyle, raising cattle and sheep and wheat and corn being maíz in this part of the world. And there's a picture of Dr. Bale. You can see that I'm going to right more over this with my mouse. You can see that he definitely looks like an Anglo-Saxon, but he's not on an Anglo-Saxon horse. This is a Mexican Mustang, a Spanish saddle, and California drop shanks, which I've seen on gauchos in the playa of Argentina. The old cowboys still wear their spurs this way. This is a late photo of Maria. Dr. Bale's medicine was not so good. He prescribed Latium. He prescribed opium. He prescribed morphine, and he loved to prescribe mercury. So that's the kind of doctor he was, quack, essentially, in English terms. As a surgeon, cut you open, he was pretty good. Stitch you up, give you enough alcohol as a disinfectant, and give you enough morphine to get through it. Hopefully you'd survive. This is where it's located. Here's the San Francisco here, and up here is Napa, the Napa Valley here, essentially one of the Grand Cru, if not the Grand Cru, wine-growing regions in the United States. And the Bale Mill is in the upper part here, right up here, about 100 miles, 80 miles north of San Francisco, 120, 130 kilometers north of San Francisco. And this is the land grant here from an old map. It's called Rancho Carne Humana, which in Spanish means ranch of the human flesh. What he called this rancho was its legal name. So again, cutting up human flesh, that was the thing. It should have been called by the local Indian village, which was Rancho Calahumanic. He didn't do that. He renamed it. All right, so his mill originally was very small. It was started in 1843. By 1846, it was completed. About a 20-foot wheel, single-story structure, no fancy cleaning equipment. It was a run-of-the-mill type mill, just milling whole wheat products. As soon as the mill was completed, and he had a sawmill that he also built to complete the grist mill, very first thing he does, mortgages the mill, goes back in debt again. Gold rush is in 1848, not 49. He got 49 is when everybody else showed up. He goes to gold country, comes back, has no gold, gets sick, has a fever for a month, dies of stomach cancer, according to the family, at 38. Likely he may have poisoned himself, we don't know. Maria Ignacia Seberanis de Bale, his wife, now has a mortgage. She has no man in her life. She's in the middle of nowhere. She's 26 and she has 6 children under the age of 10. She came from a good family and she understood foreigners. And she recognized that the population of California was probably going to grow, and it grew from about 100,000 to 3 million in about 3 years from the gold rush. And no one was prepared doing any kind of agribusiness. No one was going to have an infrastructure to feed this kind of population. She had one other thing with the mill. The mill is supplied by a spring that feeds it water year-round, which in California is unheard of. There are very few springs like this. And so she had a source of abundant water engine, essentially. And so she builds the wheel 36 foot, which is the largest water wheel west of the Mississippi River to this day. Adds all this fancy Evans cleaning equipment. The mill was capable of producing, we think, at least 200,000 pounds of flour a year, when there are only maybe 500 people living in the local area. It was insane. But she was speculating on the fact that she would be able to sell this flour. And she died in 1901. This Mexican woman died the richest woman in the entire Napa Valley. So the way it was abandoned was her legacy, and that's the way we restored it. Restoration, we'll get to that in a second, but first I want to show you how bad it got. It got pretty bad through 1910, 1915 for sure. The mill got sold to two guys who bought it 1862, as I'm documented here. Worst drought in California history. Even the springs dried up. They installed a Cornish boiler and a steam engine to try and keep the mill going. Last miller left in 79. Mill was completely dilapidated, but it was restored starting in 1988. I first saw the mill in 1963. And the restoration, as far as I'm concerned, looked like the old bones, just rejuvenated, all the way down, all the way up. Earthquake protection, electricity, everything you need to do to bring it up to compliance. All the steel was taken out during the Great War, the World War I, because of the metal drives in this country. We have a pump over system now. We lost our water rights a long time ago, so we pump over like a lot of mills do for demonstration purposes. And we are a state historic park, which means we are. That's both good and bad. Good, not so bad as sort of some of the restrictions. We have anthropologists, and we have historians, and we have environmentalists that keep an eye on us, and so we have to comply with that. Later on in 2003, my old boss, Sandy Jones, conducted another restoration where the third floor, which would be the second floor in Europe, with first floor being zero, the second floor was built out with 4 grain elevators. The threshing machine was restored. The boulder was restored. The jogger screen that was added for historical interpretation. This photo here from 1988 does not show any of those components. This is our wheat stone that I'm pointing to now, and our maize stone, our corn stone here. The cut's a little different on the stones, and pardon me. Cuts a little different on the stones. Right now we have the wheat stone elevated up to show the insides of the mill without the furniture, and we mill everything on the corn stone, and it works out just fine. Let's go on and talk about maintenance, because I know that's what everyone's interested in. We clean the bite, which is the material around the ton here, about once every 2 weeks or so, and in the summer to keep down pantry moths and other infestations, especially when it gets hot, and it does get hot here. Clean the face, meaning we lift the stone up and we vacuum it all out with a HEPA vacuum cleaner. We do that typically once a month as well, okay? And we have a series of brushes. We have the brushes for the stones. We have the brushes for the floors. We have the brushes for our colony of bats, which are in the attic, as many as 300, 400, 500 a year, who do all kinds of interesting things that bats might do, including, you know what? And so we have diapers, we have to clean that up, and we have environmentalists say, don't you dare touch those bats, they're listed. So it makes for a very interesting situation when a state health inspector comes in here, especially California State. Moving on, this is our gear cleaning process, about once a year, sometimes once every other year. We covered the teeth, wood and metal, with basically with a mixture of predominantly the wood teeth, of sheep tallow and beeswax. Old recipes still use it today. And so what'll happen is it'll get gummy, it'll get hard, it'll get ugly. There's an affectionate term we use for it, which I will not describe to you. We scrape it off. It's a team building exercise, and then we reapply it. wood to metal, wood to metal, wood to metal, all through the bottom of the mill into the hearse and everything. It's nice and quiet, no sparks, etc. But the real reason we believe they did that was for pioneer safety mechanism. If the mill jams, the wood will fail and spare the metal. If you broke a metal tooth, you're a long way around the Horn of South America to get another one. It could take months to a year or more to get a tooth replacement, a wheel gear replacement. We actually had this specific bevel gear jam, and 5 teeth broke on it. We were able to restore it relatively easily, and it worked. Here I'm going to describe Babbitts. We have a number of Babbitt bearings in our mill. I think about 25 of them. And these are called the pillow casings, the metal, cast iron metal parts. They never look like this because if you run one of these, and I'm sure many of you have them, you know that you grease them all the time, oil them all the time, I'm sorry. And when you oil them, they are greasy, oily messes, and they will never rust. The rust is only because it hasn't been used. All your shafts are a little cockeyed from each other. All these little bearings are a little off, just microscopically off. The shaft goes through in the middle, and you pour this metal alloy in through the cap here, like it's being demonstrated here, and it'll go ahead and it'll true up that shaft in those casings. And that's the magic of this. It was invented in 1839 by Isaac Babbitt, and it's a very special metal. I have not ever poured one. I have melted one out, and it melts to about the consistency of tin. Just a quick note on this: we use bar chain oil on this because it's got a very heavy viscosity, because these do leak pretty badly. And I also have a note here: anything above the millstones, like say the lubricating the damsel, we use food grade white grease for that. All right, stone dressing, I believe, will be covered by another miller on this conference today. However, I did want to go over a couple things that might not be covered. One is that we use paint staff. Our master miller and millwright, Rob Grossi, uses paint staff on this. You can actually see the red on here. We do not use iron oxide paint like they did in the old days. We use tempera, which is kindergarten paint, baby kid paint used to do finger painting, as described in this video, this photo over here. And this is a non-toxic, non-allergy paint. Typically, I believe it's even available as a vegan paint. Doped onto the stone, chipped off. Rob's demonstration, I'm sure, will show where he goes through it. He cuts the furrows on all the stitching lines, etc. That's done about, for us, probably every 3 years. I think it would be done more, significantly, much faster, much more frequently, per year. We just don't mill that much. We mill mostly for demonstrations. Now, neck bearing. This is done every few years. We actually try to true up the spindle coming up through the middle, and it's done by these wooden bushings, which is part of the bearing, which is the ways it was done originally. There are shims in here, like you would shim a door jamb, and we true this up by spinning this around. This arm spins around, and this stick quill, which is typically a feather from like a hawk or an eagle, will just touch on one side and not on the other typically, and then you adjust it, turn it and adjust it until everything lines up with that neck bearing. Well, I've actually, back in this photo, I'm underneath this thing turning the stone gear. So when you get that right, you feel confident that you're not going to get a lot of oscillation, vibration from your stones, reaction from the stones. Water wheel replacement, big deal for us. So why did the wheel get so bad? For the same reason it is for all of you. Not enough funding, not enough money. So we finally managed to get $25,000, and we look at this. This wheel is almost exclusively redwood, and yet it's rotting. This bolt is dangling. This wheel was horrible. It was heavy on one side, so it would sag. It'd thump. It would roll backwards. It'd do all kinds of crazy things. When it came down and sagged and landed with that heavy spot, to get it started again required way too much water. Water splashing everywhere in this photo. You can see it's just horrible. So this project went ahead and started a restoration of the spokes initially in 2015. Our millwright here, Rob again, got these custom made and fabricated these spokes. And I'm not going to go over the details of this, but send me an email. I'll have my email at the address at the end, and you'll see I can send you 2 or 3 YouTubes specifically on all of the details required for us to replace these spokes. Really quite interesting. Subsequently, in 2020, 5 years later, during COVID, this was done with mask protection, with testing, with vaccination, et cetera, because we all report to the local county agency here. Without any people around because we were shut down, we actually had the opportunity to restore everything, all the rest of the parts. These spokes now have aged a bit. They're 5 years old, but the wood went in. You can see it's all redwood. And it made a tremendous difference in our ability to do this. This work was done, was fabricated in Virginia by Ben Hassett, who, of course, is one of our best mill contractors in the country in the United States. And shipped here, and our crew went ahead and did it all themselves here. And here's the before and after. That's before, here's after. This after shot, by the way, is a snapshot from the video. It's running, folks. It is not stopped. It's running and it's spinning. And so it's remarkable what the difference is. And as a miller who has to actually run this apparatus, it's tremendously improved, and hopefully we'll, in another 15 years, we'll be able to restore it again. So here we go. So here's some information for you. I will send you these URLs. It'd probably be better than you trying to write them down. And most importantly, here's my email address, mpscalise@gmail.com. And send me any questions you have. I will send you a list of videos if you're curious about specific details within the mill. And this is in memory of Sandy Jones, who was a master miller, an awesome person, and a dedicated state of California park ranger. And Sandy was so instrumental for 20 years running this mill. And Sandy taught me a lot about milling. So I guess the legacy here is that we really have more than one pioneer woman involved in the Bale Grist Mill. And Sandy was certainly someone who was loved. Unfortunately, we lost her to cancer a few years ago. But she was a really good boss and a really good friend, and I do genuinely miss her. Now, at this point, we're going to proceed with a short video with our millwright, Rob Grassi, describing to you how he keeps the mill alive. And thank you very much for your time.
I really like mechanics, and I really enjoy history, and I really enjoy working with my hands. So I think kind of coupled all together, it makes it fascinating for me, and I've been that way since I was a kid. So
that's tight. Okay. Now we're gonna do these braces here. Do you have a tape measure?
I've always been interested in mills.
I'd be able to get that.
You know, wind power and water power to drive machinery. It just seems so simple and natural. I'm kind of drawn to that too. I've certainly wore a lot of hats in my life. I mean, I've had my own dairy farm and done a lot of restoration woodworking and some blacksmithing and plumbing, electrical, all kinds of things. But what really gets me going is a mill that operates.
Well, we're almost full, and we get a chance to actually run the wheel, you know, which would be nice. But I need you to grease that one bearing on the outside.
Routinely, I check the operation of the mill, and once a week I do any oiling and greasing of the bearings. And every 12 to 14 years, you need to replace almost every part on a wooden water wheel. Because there's a lot of stuff that water wheel does other than just turn around. I mean, when it's driving something, there's a lot of stress on it. Bale mill, they really use the millstones, and if you're going to use them, you need to maintain them. So we have to sharpen them about every 2 years or so. It's hard work, and it's tedious work too. 3 days in the same position, cutting by hand a pattern that, you know, that's just slightly different from another pattern, which is slightly different from another pattern.
I enjoy it. I mean, I think about all kinds of things while I'm doing it. You know, I'm solving all kinds of problems in my own mind, but, you know, a lot of people look at an easier way to do something. You get that smell, that's the smell of stone. You know, I always go back to the traditional method just because that's the way I was taught. I have the most control. To me, it makes a difference. I feel like everything I do, I've got my name on, so I do take pride in it, yeah. Okay, we'll go outside and have a look and see. To keep the mill alive, to keep it operational, that's very important to me. And to be able to let it tell its story of how it works. It's been a big part of my life, so keep me going. Makes me want to wake up in the morning, go to work.
Thank you, Mario. That was a wonderful presentation of a fascinating mill with an incredible history. We're so glad to get to see Rob at work as well. I hope all of you caught the 4 points in the last two speakers. I'm just going to repeat them again if you didn't catch them earlier, but the essential 4 points that I think are very important for helping preserve the craft of a miller are: number one, a good working mill; number two, access to a skilled millwright; number three, knowledge for the miller; and lastly, revenue to support the above. And it was great to hear from our last two millers about how they do that on each of their mills. So just a couple things, Mario, I'll mention about your mill, if I may. I found it fascinating when I was out there that they are milling with heritage wheat called Sonora that's grown in that region that's very, very old. And Bale Mill also escaped some wildfires in the last several years recently. So we're very lucky to still have Bale Mill with us. So I want to recognize that. I'm sure all of you have questions, so I want to make sure that we have a chance to open it up for questions for all of our speakers. So Nicole, is that all right?
That's perfect, Lisa. Please lead the way. Yeah.
Great. Well, we invite any of you who have questions to go ahead, and maybe if you could raise your hand or open up your mic.
Don't see any questions yet. I see a question in the chat. How does the water get to such a tall wheel? For Mario, from Daniel Campbell asked this question.
Sure, I can answer that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so originally there were 3 ponds. They were about maybe 1,000 meters up from the existing top of the water wheel. It came in on a head race that was predominantly a ditch that came along the side of the hill. We lost water rights in 1915, or before that, actually, likely. The mill was blown, the ponds were blown up in 1915 because a young woman drowned in one of the ponds. And so it's all history. So we do pump over now. So literally our tail race is a cistern. And we have a pump in there. We have an irrigation pump, which is actually installed by one of the local vineyard water pumping companies. And water's pumped up. And in the evening, we drain the race out so that there's no water left in there. And it works very well. This is basically, it's for demonstration purposes, and the mill runs like a giant fountain is how it operates, actually.
Okay, thank you, Mario. In the chat earlier, there was also the question of the proposal of a flint mill. I don't know exactly who can answer that question from the speakers.
Perhaps Tony, would you like to handle that one?
Sure. Flint mills were actually used to grind feldspar for the pottery industry.
Okay. I also had a question about the ownership of the mills in the USA. Are they mostly owned by individuals or not-for-profit organizations? How is that organized in your country? Or is that per state maybe different?
Tony, would you like to handle that one as well?
It's all of the above. Big portion of them that are open to the public are owned by local government entities, states, counties. There's a few in the National Park Service. The rest of them are small individual private nonprofits, or there's a lot of them that are owned by private individuals. As Steve pointed out earlier, we oftentimes get these people that'll give us a call and say, I bought a mill, I want to restore it and make it operational. What am I going to do? And unfortunately, many of them do not have the capital necessary to finish that conversion. So there's a lot of partially done private operated mills out there.
Yeah, so that's a problem.
Yes.
The challenge, to be sure. You have to be
Yeah.
resourceful, looking for finances and revenue to be able to help with the renovations that are required. Other questions?
Yes, Lisa. I'm wondering, do you have an estimate on how many mills in the US still grind flour for consumption? I mean, for selling to the public? I mean, not on a commercial basis, but maybe half commercial or just to fund the mill.
Yeah, that is a good question. I think you're probably referencing any that might be operating at least for demonstration and some sale. So I'm going to invite Steve or Tony, if you would like to help respond to his question.
Well, I think it's difficult to quantify that at the present time because it's such a large country. And I don't know, maybe Tony does, if any assessment has been done state by state, because the regulations in each state are also different. And the National Park Service also has some mills, but they are worried about the regimen. You know, we have a very good regimen of cleaning and product care and grain care. So Tony, maybe you know a little bit more about this nationwide than I do.
It's very dependent upon where you're located, because as you say, the regulations are different. I recently came across a series of notes in the archives from the National Park Service pulling millers across the U.S. in for a meeting in 72, I believe. It was really near when Spoon created, to have a discussion on how to market this and how to get around some of the stricter regulations around flour. And the answer literally that they came up with was, we're going to advertise it as non-edible bird seed. And with the caveat that if you want to eat it when you go home, that's up to you. And that was the answer. And unfortunately, that's still what we're working under. And
that was already in 72?
Yes.
And nowadays with these lawsuits, I think nobody will dare to sell it as a human product.
Well, there's also changes in, I want to say 2010. I was at a conference and met with the owner of Meadows Mills, and he was telling me at that point that smaller artisanal mills had acquired something like 40% of the market share in the sale of flour in the United States. Unfortunately, 2 years later, the federal government changed the rules again and made it twice as hard for historic mills to actually grind product to sell. And I've seen a lot of those that were doing it at that point. Falls Mill is one of them, I think specifically, that he had an incredible business of selling both interstate through the mail, but also a large tourism operation. And I think he had 7 or 8 restaurants and 2 or 3 distilleries he was selling to in Tennessee. And now he's converted everything to textile mill and converted it back to its original use back when it was built. all that because of it, them just making it so difficult to sell.
Here in Pennsylvania, we have a mill near Philadelphia that operates on old-looking equipment, but when the product finally gets to the packaging, it looks like a pharmaceutical clean room. He's got plexiglass walls all around it. The wooden spouts turn to PVC, and the bags are heat sealed. And it's called Castle Valley Mill. You can see their products online. They're very successful.
Yeah, I think that goes more into factory type of artisanal mill, which you also have in Europe, but I think that is going to the other side of my question, maybe. How is it with Washington's mill, Steve? Do you sell flour to the public?
We sell quite a bit. And what we've worked under in Virginia is a county inspection and state inspection that is typical for what restaurants get. But they realize we're an old structure. So we've done a few things like lining the casing of the stone
with metal.
And then recently a group of farmers near Richmond got together with a mill because the state is starting to realize these mills support local grown food and farms. And that, I think, is going to end up helping all the mills eventually. And South Carolina has been working on a bill in their state legislature to pass to allow these mills to continue to operate as they have, as long as they follow, cleanliness rules. I mean, we have to take care.
Yeah, just like in Holland, we have these self-applied clean schedules.
Yeah, and it's always funny with inspection because you can never not do what the inspector wants. That wouldn't be wise. But one day the man came 10 years ago and he noticed a little gap in the front door at the bottom. He said a mouse can get in there. So we fixed that. He didn't ask me about the two giant arches where the water flows in to turn the wheel, So when that happens, you just kind of say, yes, sir, I will fix the gap in the door. Thank you. We will do that.
That's the only thing you can do. Yeah.
But we also have a grain freezer on the farm. So I think I tell a lot of small mills, you need to have proper cold storage for your product. And then you also don't lose grain, and because the summers in America are very, very hot and humid.
Okay.
So I've got several pallets of grain always stored and kept properly.
So this is Doug Chard. I don't know if you can hear me at all.
Yes.
So I last year visited New England and I came across two grist mills on Cape Cod, both of which are selling flour to the public. One of which was in Pilgrim's Rock, near to the harbour. And that was, as you described, it was very antiseptic. They had lots of plastic screens and the rest of it. But the other one it's called Dexter's Mill in Sandwich in Cape Cod. And they were doing a fairly small scale and putting it into canvas bags that were sealed up. But I didn't observe any of the same sort of hygiene systems running there.
I'm happy to jump in on that one. That's all right. For the mills that I've operated, we have gone through a process of being licensed, and in the state where I live, it's through the Department of Agriculture. And so that includes being inspected and taking a lot of the precautions that Steve referenced. We're in the process of, those of us that have been in milling for several years, of assisting some of these other mills and young millers with that process of getting licensed so that they understand how to work with their local authorities. So it's a slow process to reach out to all the mills that are in need of that, but we're working on it. So good point.
Thank you, everybody, for answering.
Yes, I can comment on that too. So at the Bale Mill, we're the only functioning mill, fully functioning mill in California that's left. There were originally probably somewhere in the neighborhood of about 48 from the Mexican period into the American to the 19th century. And we are a state historic park, which means we're, I think, as I mentioned in my presentation, we have all kinds of specific limitations. So we can't install things like plexiglass and stainless steel and try to commercialize our product. However, we do sell our product, and we sell it as a souvenir. And We're forced by the health department to put not for human consumption on the back of it, which means you're entitled to give it to your chickens. That's basically how we get around that. We do that with a wink. My interpretation is that all flour, commercially grown, including the flour we sell, which is almost exclusively commercially grown, USDA, organic, all flour that is raw is not for human consumption. It can make you sick, can contain contaminants. If you cook it thoroughly, you're on your own, and that's true of commercial flour as well. That's how we handle that.
Thank you, Mario. Are there other questions that participants have?
I don't
Oh,
see.
I see one from Charlie Yeski.
Very good.
Thank you. Before this session is over, on behalf of SPOOM, the Society for the Preservation of Old Mills, of which I have the honor of being president, I want to extend a personal thanks to Nicole and to Alicia for putting this together. It's been most informative and a good mark for what's going on in the States. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you especially for Elisa and all the speakers, because they did all the work. That's great. Yeah, it was very interesting. Okay, I don't think there are any other people with questions. Please open your mic or raise your hand.
Elisa, I have a personal question for you. Do you still have a mill in the US?
I have milling equipment that's waiting for a new location is the answer. Thank you for asking.
Interesting. A water mill, probably.
Perhaps a solar mill.
Oh.
Okay. Elisa, do you want to speak any final words about this conference?
I would like to thank all of our speakers, and if any of the four or all of the four would just like to offer a final word to close the conference, I would like to invite them to do so. So maybe we could go in the order of our presentation. So Tony, that would be you first.
I want to thank everybody for coming out today. Milling in America has been a long and interesting story, and luckily, thanks to a lot of people that you've talked to today, it's a continuing story, and it's one that we keep delving into and finding a lot more about on a regular basis. Welcome everybody to stop in if you're around Philadelphia region. We have several things going on at Newlin Grist Mill, including regular archaeological investigations. We're rebuilding a water wheel as an experimental archaeology project right now, using all 18th century tools and techniques. So we're constantly trying to learn more about milling in the early 18th century. Thank you very much.
Great. Harry, any last words you'd like to share about the Tide Mill Institute?
Not too many, actually. I'm clearly new at this game from the other folks who are here, and working mostly with mills that don't exist any longer. From the Tide Mill side, there's very little left, as we noted. And I've been finding that the people within Tide Mill Institute certainly have some background, and I'm learning a lot from it. So we'll stay with it. And I appreciate your invitation today to speak as little as we did, a little time as we had.
Well, we're glad that Tide Mills were represented, so thank you, Harry. Steve, any last words?
Well, I would like to thank Nicole, of course, for coordination of all this with Elisa and Lisa's work. And I was fortunate to travel a fair amount in Europe and look at mills over the years. And so it's kind of been an ethic, I think, for some of us American mills to try to put into practice what's done in Europe. And I think we're making pretty good headway in many areas, but we're a big country, so there's a lot of different criteria state by state. But that's why these sort of opportunities to share are so important, so we can learn from each other, but also so the Europeans can also see that we have some good mills here and things ongoing. And as Elisa knows, we didn't get into American windmills, but we will maybe in another time. But thanks for letting me be a part of it. I appreciate it.
Great. It was wonderful to have you. And sorry, Harry, did you have one more?
Oh, I just wanted to ask people to consider our next conference in 4 days, which will be centered on tide mills, not water mills per se. And that's in Portland, and it will be a hybrid. So it'll be online also. And if you register at tidemillinstitute.org, then you'll get the link.
Great. Thank you, Harry. And Mario.
Yes, yes, I'd like to first start off by thanking you, Elisa, for pulling this together. And thanks to all of you for attending. And I also want to thank the other presenters for doing an outstanding job. And Nicole, I want to thank you as well, because I've really enjoyed the Craft of the Miller presentations in the past, especially the ones predominantly on European mills. I found them really fascinating. It's really great. As for us, we are open weekends. If anyone finds yourself in Northern California and the San Francisco Bay Area, certainly consider stopping by and seeing us. And thank you very much.
Wonderful. Well, thank you to all of the speakers again for their participation and contributions with their presentations. Thank you to all of you for taking time out of your day today, whatever time of day it is for you, for joining this fantastic conference. And thank you to the Dutch Mill Society for helping organize these conferences. And I just want to remind everyone, it's a special year for the Dutch Mill Society. I know what that means, but I'll let Nicole tell what special year it is for them.
Oh, thank you, Elisa. Well, the Dutch Mill Society is in this year 100 years old, so it's a big year of celebrations. And well, we just have a few more events going on before the end of the year, and well, we really enjoyed it. And about the conferences on the website of network.molens.nl, you can also find the recordings of the other conferences if you want, and this one will be on there within 1 or 2 weeks when my colleague has time to put it on. Okay, I thank you very much for joining, and I hope to see you next time. And well, have a nice day. Bye bye.